The battlefield might seem like a place of finality, but what was found afterward raises more questions than answers. From soldiers' pockets filled with paper money to a flag hidden beneath a lifeless body, the aftermath reveals a side of history we rarely explore. How did these seemingly small items become symbols of a much larger story? We're about to step back into the aftermath of one of the bloodiest battles in American history, where every discovery adds a new layer of mystery. Let's take a closer look at what really remained after Custer's last stand. On June 25th, 1876, the Battle of the Little Bighorn became a devastating defeat for the U.S. 7th Cavalry. 5 companies under General George Armstrong Custer were completely overrun. The scene that followed was one of total loss, a massacre. The Lakota Sioux and Cheyenne warriors who fought against us were prepared, outnumbering and outmaneuvering us in a way we hadn't anticipated. There wasn't a chance for survival once the ambush began. After the battle, stories surfaced about what happened on the battlefield in the hours after the fighting stopped. White Wolf, one of the Cheyenne who had fought in the battle, talked about how young men moved among the bodies of the fallen soldiers, searching their pockets. They found green paper money, money that held no value to them in this place, in the middle of the plains. Instead, that money, which had once symbolized power and wealth, was later used by children to make toy horses' saddle blankets. It was just paper now, no more meaningful than the earth it had fallen on. Among the dead soldiers, silver money was also found. The Cheyenne melted the coins down and repurposed them into buckles, small pieces of the soldiers' world that were turned into something useful in theirs. The idea that the same silver the soldiers had carried into battle for trade or exchange was now being used as decoration on the clothing of their enemies was a sobering thought. It wasn't victory that had turned the tide, it was survival. There were also the tales of warriors like Wooden Leg, Little Hawk, and Bobtail Horse, finding bottles of whiskey on the bodies of dead troopers. The whiskey, brought into battle as something to calm nerves or steel mines, was now a relic of the dead, taken by those who had no use for its intended purpose. It was just another piece of what had been lost that day, something that no longer had any value in this place, where survival, not comfort, mattered most. The battlefield itself was a place of death and destruction. Bodies of soldiers were left where they had fallen, lifeless, naked, and stripped of anything of value. The scene was gruesome. Men, horses, and equipment all scattered across the field. The hot sun bore down on the bodies, swelling and bloating them, making the entire field smell of death. There was nothing quiet about the place. The silence was eerie, filled with the absence of life, yet heavy with the weight of what had just happened. The warriors moved swiftly through the bodies, taking whatever could be useful, clothing, weapons, anything that could serve a purpose. What was left behind were the soldiers' bare bodies, exposed under the sky, lying in the dirt, and dust unburied. There was no reverence for the dead, no time to mourn. It was the way of war. To the victor went the spoils. I remember hearing how Custer had tried to rally his men, standing tall on his horse, directing them as the battle descended into chaos. But it was futile. The Sioux and Cheyenne were everywhere, moving fast and with purpose, and the soldiers couldn't keep up. Custer fell, as did everyone around him. No one was spared. After the battle, the stories of the young warriors scavenging the field spread. The image of children playing with pieces of soldiers' uniforms and making use of the paper money as toy horse blankets painted a stark contrast to the grim reality of the soldiers' fate. While the soldiers had brought that money into the battle as part of their world, it had no place here. The children saw it as something to play with, unaware of what it had meant in the lives of the men who once carried it. The battle had been over quickly, but the aftermath was long and brutal. As I walked through the field in the days that followed, stepping over the bodies of men who had once fought beside me, the weight of the loss was almost too much to bear. The ground was soaked with blood, and the stench of death hung heavy in the air. Horses lay dead alongside their riders, their bodies twisted in unnatural positions. The grass, once tall and green, had been trampled flat, mixed with the dirt and blood of the fallen. There was no glory in what had happened here. The soldiers had fought bravely, but they had been overwhelmed. The Lakota and Cheyenne had won the battle, not just because they were more prepared, but because they were fighting for their survival. They weren't fighting for glory or conquest. They were fighting for their way of life. And in the end, they had won. The soldiers, on the other hand, had lost everything. Their lives, their possessions, and even their dignity had been stripped away. They lay naked and mutilated on the field, their bodies left to rot in the sun. There was nothing left to honor, nothing left to remember them by, except for the scars they had left on the land. In the days that followed, the stories of what had happened at Little Bighorn spread. Some called it Custer's last stand, a moment of heroism and tragedy. But for those of us who had been there, who had walked through the aftermath, it wasn't heroism that we remembered. It was the bodies, the smell of death, and the realization that in the end, none of it had mattered. We had come to fight for land, for power, for the promise of a future. But all we had found was death. The soldiers had died for something they believed in. But in the end, it was just a battle for survival. And survival had favored the Lakota and Cheyenne that day. On June 27, 1876, we rode onto the battlefield, a place that would haunt me for the rest of my days. The stench hit us before we even saw the bodies, the smell of death hanging in the air like a thick fog. What we found that day was something no man should ever have to witness. Lieutenant E.S. Godfrey, who was with us, later described the scene as one of pure desolation. And he was right. The bodies of our fallen comrades were scattered across the field, their skin marble white, a sharp contrast against the brown of the dead horses and ponies lying beside them. The sight was worst on and around Custer Hill, where the fighting had clearly been the most intense. There the grass was trampled and stained red, and the soil had turned a ghostly white from the dust of battle. The whole place felt eerily quiet, a scene so lonely and desolate that it weighed on your heart like a heavy stone. No one spoke for a long time as we took it all in. Captain Tom Custer was the first body we found. He was lying near the top of the hill, just a few yards from his brother, General Custer. He was on his face, and his features were so disfigured, pressed into the ground and swollen, that he was almost unrecognizable. His back was riddled with arrows. There were so many I lost count. He, and more arrows, had been driven into his head. One of them was bent so badly it could hardly be pulled out. His skull had been crushed, and nearly all of his hair had been scalped, except for a small patch left at the back of his neck. It was a gruesome sight, one that turned my stomach and made me feel weak. Not far from him lay General Custer himself. His body, unlike the others, hadn't been mutilated. He was lying on his back, arms resting at his sides, hands crossed over his stomach, as if he had simply lain down for a nap. It was a position we'd seen him in many times during the long marches when he'd stop for a brief rest. It was strange, almost peaceful, but he was dead just the same. There were 2 wounds on his body, one in his left temple and another near his heart. Both clean, quick. Whoever killed him hadn't done it out of cruelty. Perhaps they respected him enough to leave his body untouched, or maybe they just wanted it to be known who had fallen there. A little further from the hill, we found Boston Custer, the youngest of the brothers. He had been stripped of everything except for his white cotton socks, and even those had been cut with the name tag removed. It was a strange detail that someone had taken the time to cut the name out of his socks. His body, like so many others, had been stripped bare, and it was hard to look at him and think that just days before, he had been full of life, riding into battle with his brothers. As we continued to search the field, we found more bodies, each one more mutilated than the last. Arrows stuck out from every direction, and the dead were stripped of their uniforms, their names lost to the wilderness. The scene was one of utter devastation, the likes of which I had never seen before. It was as if the battlefield itself had been cursed. We did what we could for the dead, though it wasn't much. With the few tools we had, shovels, axes, and knives, we dug shallow graves where the men had fallen, covering them with dirt and stones. It wasn't the burial they deserved, but it was all we could do. We left them there in that desolate place, far from home, and far from the loved ones who would never see them again. 2 days after the massacre, and the first thing I remember was the smell. Death has a smell that sticks with you long after you leave, and this battlefield reeked of it. The hot sun had been baking the bodies of men and horses alike, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. We had come to bury the dead, but nothing could have prepared us for the scale of what we found. As far as the eye could see, there were bodies, some mutilated beyond recognition, others barely touched except for the fatal wounds that had taken their lives. The land itself seemed to cry out with the horrors that had taken place here. Most of the bodies were naked, their clothing stripped away by the victors. Occasionally, we'd come across a man who still wore a bloody undershirt, a pair of trousers or socks, but the name tags had invariably been cut out. It was a small detail, but it struck me every time. Even in death, the identities of these men had been erased, as if they had never existed. The mutilations were horrifying, scalps taken, limbs twisted and broken, arrows protruding from bodies that had long since stopped bleeding. It was hard to look at them, hard to think of them as men who had families waiting for them back home. They were nearly unrecognizable, reduced to bloody, mangled shapes lying in the dust. We didn't have much in the way of tools. There were perhaps half a dozen spades and shovels, as many axes, a couple of picks, and a few hatchets between all of us. With these and whatever else we could find, knives, tin cups, anything we could use, we went over the field, trying to give the bodies some semblance of a burial. It was slow, back-breaking work. The earth was hard, and we were miles from anywhere, with no hope of proper graves or even markers. All we could do was cover them with a thin layer of dirt, enough to hide them from view. It wasn't much, but it was the best we could do in that vast wilderness, far from civilization, far from the homes and families of the men we were burying. We were a long way from home, and I think that weighed on us as we worked. There was no one here to mourn these men, but us. No wives, no children, no mothers or fathers to weep over their graves. We were the only ones who would ever know where they had fallen. And we knew that soon enough, the wolves and the elements would come for them. It felt like a hopeless task, but we had no choice. The bodies had to be buried, and we were the only ones left to do it. I remember trumpeter Giuseppe Martini coming across a particularly gruesome sight in a deep gully between Custer's position and the river. There was a heap of bodies there, men who had clearly fallen together, perhaps trying to make one last stand. One of the first sergeants had been entrusted with the pay for many of the men, and when Martini found him, his body was surrounded by torn-up paper money. Around $500, Martini said, shredded and scattered across the body, as if the money had somehow lost its value the moment the man had died. It was a strange sight, the paper bills fluttering in the breeze over the corpse, a reminder of the futility of wealth in the face of death. Martini also found the body of Adjutant Cook. His sideburn had been scalped clean off, skin and all. I think that detail stuck with me more than most. It wasn't just the killing, it was the sheer brutality of it, the way the bodies had been desecrated. It was a reminder that this wasn't just a battle, it was something far worse. There was hatred here, something primal and violent that went beyond the usual horrors of war. As we continued to make our way through the field, the reports from the scouts grew more disturbing. 7th Cavalry Scout George Herendeen found something in the Sioux camp that sent chills down all of our spines. He came across the heads of 4 white soldiers severed from their bodies, but the bodies were nowhere to be found. Herendeen searched the battlefield, searched the village, but the rest of the men were gone. It was as if they had simply disappeared, leaving behind only their heads as grim trophies. The thought of it made my stomach turn. We had all heard stories of what could happen in battles like this, but hearing about it was one thing. Seeing it was something else entirely. Lieutenant Charles Rowe of the 2nd Cavalry had his own horror story. In the Indian village, he found a white man's head with a lariat tied to it. The head had been dragged around the village, Rowe said, until it had been pulled clean off the body. I couldn't wrap my mind around it. The cruelty, the sheer violence of it. It wasn't enough to kill these men. They had to be humiliated, their bodies desecrated in ways that seemed beyond human understanding. We had seen death before, but this was something else. It was a reminder that out here, in this wilderness, there were no rules. There was only survival, and survival came at any cost. As we worked, the sun beat down on us, and the smell of decay hung in the air like a heavy fog. We tried to move quickly, but the work was slow and grueling. The bodies were stiff and bloated, and the ground was hard, making it difficult to dig even the shallowest of graves. We didn't have enough tools, didn't have enough men, didn't have enough time. Every moment we spent out there felt like an eternity. The weight of what had happened pressing down on us with every shovel full of dirt. The field was so vast, the dead so numerous, that it felt like we were never going to finish. At one point, we came across the body of Corporal John Foley. His body had been stripped of everything but his trousers and boots, and he had been scalped. Next to him was what we later learned was the Culbertson Guidon, hidden beneath his body. It was one of the few flags carried by Custer's men that had survived the battle, and finding it there, beneath the body of a fallen soldier, was a strange reminder of what had been lost. Foley, like so many others, had tried to escape. He had been pursued by the Sioux, and realizing he couldn't outrun them, had shot himself in the head before they could capture him. It was a small mercy, I suppose, that he hadn't lived long enough to experience the same mutilations as the others. The flag was recovered and taken back with us, one of the few relics of the battle that would make it home. We worked late into the day, but there were too many bodies and not enough time. The sun was setting by the time we finished, casting long shadows across the battlefield. The field, which had once been filled with the sounds of gunfire and the screams of men and horses, was silent now, save for the wind rustling through the grass. The bodies were gone, buried beneath the earth, but the memory of what had happened here would stay with us forever. I think about what we saw out there sometimes. I think about the men we buried, the mutilations, the severed heads, the torn-up money. I think about the smell of death and the silence that followed. And I think about how, in the end, all we could do was cover them with dirt and leave them behind in that wilderness, far from home. There was no honor in it, no glory, just death, and the knowledge that no matter how far we traveled, we would never forget what we had seen. That battlefield became a part of us, a place we would carry with us for the rest of our lives. As we rode away, I couldn't help but look back one last time. The sun was dipping below the horizon, casting a red glow across the field. It was quiet now, the bodies buried, the battle over. But in my mind's eye, I could still see them, the naked, mutilated bodies, the bloody fatal wounds, the faces distorted in pain and terror. I could still smell the stench of decay, still hear the wind blowing across the grass. I knew, even then, that I would never truly leave that battlefield behind. Years later, people would talk about Custer's last stand as a moment of bravery, a noble sacrifice. But for those of us who were there, it wasn't about bravery. It wasn't about glory. It was about survival and the terrible cost that came with it. The men we buried that day paid the ultimate price, and we, those of us who survived, were left to carry the weight of it for the rest of our lives. Survivor Jacob Adams gave one of the most haunting testimonies from the aftermath of the Battle of Little Bighorn. He described a scene that chilled the blood. Troopers who had been lassoed from their horses, dragged into the heart of the village by the Sioux and Cheyenne, and tied to trees. That night, within sight of Benteen's division, who were helpless to intervene, these men were burned alive. Benteen's men, though close enough to see the flames and hear the cries, could do nothing. They were outnumbered, exhausted, and out of range. All they could do was watch as their comrades perished in the most horrific way imaginable. This wasn't just death on the battlefield. This was something far more cruel, far more personal. It was a deliberate act of terror, meant to break the spirit of the soldiers and send a message that the land they were fighting over would not be taken easily. After the battle, when the fighting had ended and the dust began to settle, the scenes that greeted the soldiers who came to retrieve the dead were beyond anything they had ever seen. John Ryan, a member of the burial party, recounted the gruesome discovery of human bones scattered around the village. These bones, he explained, were found alongside parts of blue uniforms, torn and burned, marking the places where the troopers had been tied to stakes and trees. The sight was one of utter devastation. the remains of men who had been tortured and killed in full view of their comrades. What had once been soldiers, men with names, families, and futures, were now reduced to charred bones and shreds of cloth, remnants of lives destroyed in the most brutal way. As we moved through the battlefield, trying to make sense of the chaos, and as it became clear that this wasn't just a loss, it was a massacre. Of the 5 guidons carried by Custer's troops during what would later be called their last stand, only one was immediately recovered. This small flag, once a proud symbol of unity and strength, was found concealed under the body of a dead trooper, Corporal John Foley. Foley had been one of the many men who tried to escape the carnage on horseback, but the Sioux pursued him relentlessly. Rather than allow himself to be captured and face the same fate as so many of his comrades, Foley made a fateful decision. He shot himself in the head just moments before he would have been overtaken. His body, like so many others, lay scattered on the field, but beneath him the flag remained, hidden from view. That flag, known today as the Culbertson Guidon, was named after Sergeant Ferdinand Culbertson, a member of the burial party who found it. The Culbertson Guidon became a symbol of the battle, a relic of a fight that had cost so many lives. For those of us who had been there, it represented not just the bravery of Custer's men, but the tragedy that had unfolded on that day. What had once flown proudly above the battlefield was now a silent witness to the destruction, a piece of cloth that had been soaked in blood and buried under a dead man. The Guidon itself would eventually find its way into the hands of history. In 2010, more than a century after it had been recovered from the battlefield, the Culbertson Guidon was sold at a Sotheby's auction for $2.2 million to a private collector. It was a strange thing to think about, how a piece of fabric that had been part of such a devastating event could become a collector's item, an artifact worth millions of dollars. For those of us who had seen the battle firsthand, who had lived through the horrors of that day, the monetary value of the flag seemed insignificant compared to what it truly represented. It wasn't just a piece of history, it was a symbol of everything that had been lost on that field. The battlefield itself was a silent witness to the carnage, stretching out across the plains, dotted with the bodies of soldiers and horses alike. As the burial parties moved through the field, they were met with scenes of unimaginable brutality. Bodies were mutilated, scalps taken, and men stripped of their clothing, leaving only the bloody remains of what had once been proud soldiers. The ground was stained red, and the air was thick with the smell of death and decay. It was a scene that none of us would ever forget. I remember the exhaustion in the faces of the men as they worked to bury the dead. We had few tools, a handful of shovels, a couple of picks, and whatever else we could find. The earth was hard, baked by the sun, and digging graves was slow, grueling work. Most of the bodies were buried where they had fallen, covered with a thin layer of dirt and rocks. There wasn't time for proper burials, and there certainly weren't enough men to dig the deep graves that the fallen soldiers deserved. It felt like a poor attempt to restore some dignity to the dead, but it was all we could do. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the battlefield, the men continued their work in silence, the weight of what they had seen pressing down on them with every shovel full of earth. As we worked, stories began to circulate among the men, tales of bravery and sacrifice, of desperate last stands and futile attempts to escape. But the stories that stuck with me the most were the ones about the aftermath, the horrors that had unfolded after the battle had ended. Men who had been lassoed from their horses, dragged to the village, and burned alive in front of their comrades. Soldiers who had been stripped, mutilated, and left to rot in the sun. It was clear that this battle had been more than just a fight for land or power. It had been a clash of cultures, a war not just between soldiers, but between ways of life. The Sioux and Cheyenne had fought to protect their land, their families, their way of life, and in the end, they had won. But the cost had been high for both sides. The battlefield, now littered with the bodies of the dead, was a graveyard of sorts, a place where the living and the dead were bound together by the violence that had unfolded there. The men who had fought and died on that field were now part of the landscape, their blood soaked into the earth, their bodies buried in shallow graves. For those of us who had survived, it was a reminder of the fragility of life and of the terrible cost of war. As we rode away from the battlefield, I couldn't help but think about the guidon we had found under Foley's body. It was just a piece of cloth, but it had come to represent so much more. It was a symbol of bravery, of sacrifice, of the men who had given everything in the name of duty. But it was also a reminder of the senselessness of it all, the lives lost, the families left behind, the devastation that war had wrought on both sides. That flag had once flown proudly over the battlefield, but now it was a relic of a fight that had torn apart not just lives, but entire communities. The story of Little Bighorn is one that needs to be remembered, not just for the soldiers who fought and died there, but for the lessons it holds. It's a story of bravery and sacrifice, but also of the terrible consequences of violence and war. The men who died on that field were more than just names on a list. They were sons, brothers, husbands, fathers. They had dreams, hopes, and futures that were taken from them in an instant. And for those of us who survived, the battle didn't end when the fighting stopped. The memories of what we saw that day, the bodies, the mutilations, the burning men, will stay with us forever. History has a way of repeating itself, and it's up to us to remember the lessons of the past so that we don't make the same mistakes again. The Battle of Little Bighorn wasn't just a moment in time, it was a turning point, a moment that shaped the future of this country and the lives of the people who lived here. And it's a story that needs to be told again and again so that we never forget the cost of war, the price of violence, and the lives that were lost in the process. If you found this story as compelling as I have, I invite you to follow this channel for more historical insights and stories. We delve into the details of history that are often overlooked, the moments that shaped our world in ways we might not fully understand. There are countless stories like the one at Little Bighorn, stories of bravery, of tragedy, of moments that changed the course of history. By exploring these stories, we not only honor the people who lived them, but we also learn from them, ensuring that the lessons of the past are not forgotten. Subscribe now to continue this journey through history, to uncover the stories that have been buried in time, and to gain a deeper understanding of the events that have shaped our world. There is so much more to discover, and together we can keep the memory of these moments alive.